MIDI is such a large subject that we could fill an entire video series, so in this chapter we're going to focus on some cool things that you can do with the standard tools and then take a look at the new features. By the end of this chapter, you should have a solid understanding of the key editor, drum editor and in-place editor, dissolving and bouncing parts, new ways to use traditional controller lanes, how note expression works, and how to set up expression maps. Since the MIDI functions in Cubase have been around since 1984, I'll assume that you're up to speed on creating and recording MIDI tracks, and I'll dive right into editing. Double-click a MIDI part to open the key editor. This window has all the same basic tools as the other editors, plus an area at the bottom for controller lanes. Note data is displayed in the main editing window. You can delete notes, move them around, and adjust them. But you can also use the line tool to create large numbers of notes in a snap. Change the grid if you want to change the resolution. You can also edit your MIDI right in the project window. Just flip on the in-place editor. To make drum parts easier to work with, you can open your part in the drum editor. You have the same basic stuff here, but the notes are shown as diamonds centered around where they occur on the timeline. You have a drumstick tool instead of a pen tool, and you have drum names to the left instead of the usual piano keyboard. If you have a note that needs a longer duration, like a crash cymbal, flip back to the key editor and set its duration in the normal way. Having all your drums on one track makes editing easy, plus it keeps the track count down, but what if you want to mix them like traditional kits? Use different EQ and different effects on different drums. Well, one way to do this is to use Dissolve Part from the MIDI menu. Use separate pitches to get each drum sound on its own track. Now, one downside, I also just created more copies of Groove Agent 1, so keep an eye on the performance meter when you do this. If all you need to do is break out the MIDI parts so that you can edit the notes, there's a better way. Dissolve the part again, but this time select Dissolve to Lanes. Now we can work with each drum in its own MIDI lane, but we don't have to deal with more tracks and extra instruments. As long as we have the parts separated, let me show you a cool trick. Open the hi-hat and the velocity controller. Use the line tool, but put it in sawtooth mode. This will generate some shuka. Now, call up the pan controller and do it again. Instant auto pan. Lots of possibilities here, you get the idea. Now I can put it all back together by selecting all the lanes and activating Bounce MIDI. Now, as cool as controller lanes are for that kind of stuff, this is cooler because note expression attaches the controller data to individual notes. Now here's what you need to get started. Note expression requires a compatible instrument. This is brand new, so right now the only one that you're likely to have is Halion Sonic SE. Plus, only sounds with the appropriate extension in their names recognize note expression. Open the key editor. To start, click on the Show Note Expression button in the toolbar. Then open the Note Expression tab in the inspector. You have to set this up before you can work with the controllers. There are two kinds of controllers listed, VST controllers and MIDI controllers. The VST controllers are shown first. and there's the dotted line. Remember that VST controllers aren't universal like MIDI, so how many you'll see and which ones depends on what instrument you're working with. Use the check mark to pick out which controls you want displayed, and let's just pick out everything for now. When you pick a controller, the bottom parts of the menu show information about it. But here's the fun part, editing with note expression. Double-click a note to open the note expression window, which we'll call a picture frame. You can use the left and right arrow keys on your keyboard to jump around to other notes. And watch this. If you grab a bunch of notes and double-click, you'll see all their controller data. This way you can tweak stuff for the whole chord if you want to. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back to one note. If the note doesn't have any controller data, you can add it with the pen tool. But before you do, look at the upper left-hand corner. If it's blue, you're in one-shot mode. And wherever you click the pencil, you'll get a straight line. That's handy if you want one value, but a pain if you want to draw curves. For curves, make sure that one shot is off. You can even use overdub and play it in or use a joystick. The picture frame defaults to the length of the note, and that can be kind of cramped. There are handles to pull it open at the bottom center and lower right. The lower left has a menu to select which controller you're editing. Moving clockwise, we have 8 more tools hidden in the picture frame. Hovering at the bottom calls up a horizontal scaling tool. When the crosshairs appears, drag that portion of the active controller left or right to sculpt the curve. You have controls for vertical and horizontal snap, center, left, and top right. The vertical snap is handy if you're editing tuning. That way the pitch jumps to the next fixed interval. There are 4 smart spots around the edges. They bring up different sizing tools that you can use to squish and squeeze and fade the controller information. The manual actually calls this tilting and compressing, but you get the idea. And look at this. You can highlight just a part of the controller and use the smart spots on it. To get rid of it, select the controller data and hit delete. In the lower right, you'll see a value readout. What's there depends on what you're editing. Most MIDI controllers will obviously give you a value of between 0 and 127. If you need to use a traditional controller lane, that's still available at the bottom. Expression maps sound complicated, but they're pretty straightforward. An expression map allows you to trigger different versions of a sound to get more realistic results. The concept goes back to the first MIDI keyboards. Back then, keyboards weren't even velocity sensitive, so every note was played at the same volume. When they introduced velocity control, you could play different notes at different volumes, and all you had to do was push the keys harder. Expression maps are an extension of that same concept, except they let you trigger entirely different sounds. So for example, we have bass sounds that mimic normal playing, and then we have bass sounds that mimic muted playing. Of course, a real bass player would switch back and forth as they played. But when using virtual instruments, we have to figure out how and when to change sounds. That's where expression maps come into play. An expression map lets us switch between sounds on the fly. There are 3 basic ways to switch sounds. The oldest method is to send program change commands to your instrument. This makes it change its preset to a new patch and then change back again. This is clunky, but if you're using older external equipment, it may be your only option. A better way is to set up a multi-voiced instrument with the different sounds on different MIDI channels. Then send the notes on different channels when you want the different sounds. But this is still more of a recording technique than a playing technique. I think the best way is something called key switches. This kind of key switch has nothing to do with transposing. It means we're literally going to use some of the keys on your MIDI keyboard as switches, and you're going to press them down to change sounds, like a control surface. You play the musical part with one part of the keyboard, and you trigger the sound changes with another. This is similar to how you would use a mod wheel or a pitch bender. To keep things moving along, I'm going to use a preset which already has an expression map. You can tell this by the VX in its name. The expression map and the key switches don't load automatically. To load the expression map, open the Expression Map tab, left-click where it says No Expression Map, and select Import Key Switches. Here is a basic expression map using key switches. You have 4 parts to this window. On the left is where you name your map and set up the keys that you'll use to change sounds. These controller keys are called remote keys. You set the first one, called the root key, then choose how you want additional remote keys added. Now in latch mode, the new sound will stay active until you hit another remote key. With latch mode off, the new sound is only active while you hold down the remote key. The center area is called sound slots, and this is where you actually connect the remote keys to the new sounds. In this example, we have C0 set up to trigger the open and soft articulation. Pressing C#0 will switch the instruments to open and hard, and holding down D0 will switch to a muted sound, and so forth. Use the plus and minus to add or delete articulations. Then use other columns to set up layers and combinations. You could set up C#0 to trigger any of these along with the open hard articulation. You'll notice 2 things here: musical terms and musical symbols. This is really cool because Cubase will record these too. So when you open the score editor, the dynamics and articulation symbols will be there. If you're not familiar with these terms, a basic music dictionary will help. The last column assigns a color code so that you can keep track of them in various editors. The area in the bottom right is used to define and group your articulations. The manual goes through this section in great detail, but it's mostly used to organize setups. The area in the upper right is used to modify the outgoing MIDI data. For example, I could set this up so that when C0 was pressed, the MIDI notes were also transposed. You can set up as many expression maps as you'd like. I have mine set up for families of instruments like strings, brass, and woodwinds. It does take practice to get comfortable with them, but the creative potential is worth it. Now let's move on to the next chapter and see how these articulations look in the score editor.